Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of using either a drogue or a parachute anchor on a cruising catamaran. And this is all based on our first-hand experiences of using both methods while crossing the Pacific Ocean twice back in 2008. Now, one of the realities of ocean cruising in a catamaran is that eventually you're going to hit some heavy weather, as they call it. And there's various techniques, lying a hull, heaving to. But for a catamaran, using a drogue and a parachute anchor are the two prime methods that you will use. And so in this video, we're going to talk about them and give you some tips, pointers, so that you can make a decision on what's going to work best for you in your type of boat.
Welcome to the Catamaran Cruising Channel, where we share helpful knowledge, tips, product reviews, and info on sailing, cruising, and boat building to help you get out there and actually live the dream on the water. We are Carly and Garrett, and we built our catamaran over 20 years ago and have 20,000 miles of adventures in the Pacific Northwest, Mexico, the Sea of Cortez, the Hawaiian Islands, and crossing the Pacific Ocean twice. Subscribe below to start your adventure. We want to see you out there.
Okay, so before we talk about drogues and parachute anchors, the first and most important thing about cruising on the open ocean is picking the right season to cover your particular passage. And in the Pacific Northwest, if you're leaving the BC coast to head down to California and Mexico, basically you have this window of mid-June till end of August to make sure you leave the Pacific Northwest. Any other time other than that, you're getting into gale season and you're going to get some very challenging weather. And so the reality is, if you're going to go down to Mexico, you can't leave in June and do it in one go, because you can only go far as essentially Ensenada before you have to wait, because it's hurricane season down in the Baja area. And so you basically have to wait there till December 1st to head farther south. And so this is a prime factor in planning any of your cruising, is to go at the right time. And Jimmy Cornell writes an important book about all the cruising routes, when's the best time, and a lot of it is common knowledge, where there's hurricane season and when there's not, or typhoon season. But it's very important that you plan your trips using that knowledge. Otherwise, you're going to get into trouble. And we met several people on our trip, and they said, "Oh well, I've got a 50-foot boat. I've got a big boat, so I can go, fringe season to make it down the coast." The reality is, on the open ocean, every boat other than an ocean liner is a small boat, and so you have to pick the right times. And if you do, if your boat is well found, you'll have a successful trip. And when we did our trip back in 2006 to 2008, initially our boat was only 28 feet long before we extended it down in Mexico. And so we went down the coast, down California, Oregon, all the way down, and we had some 35 knots weather, but nothing dangerous. And that's far different than getting into a storm in wintertime off the Oregon coast, where you might have 50, 60 knots, fast-moving fronts where the seas shift from one direction, shift 180 degrees to the other direction, creating very confused seas. So plan your trips using the right time and you'll have a good trip. Another point that's come up is that we hear these stories about people being caught in a hurricane, off the Florida coast. Well, trying to do a trip to the Bahamas or trying to go to the Virgin Islands in that hurricane season off Florida is asking for trouble, and really it's totally avoidable. You have to pick the right times to do those passages. Any other time, you're playing Russian roulette, really. And so we'd really encourage you to use common sense and realize that weather windows can shrink very quickly. These systems move very fast, very unpredictable, and though your boat may be able to do 10 knots, it may not be able to do 10 knots in the direction you want to go when that storm is coming. And as well, here on the Pacific coast, in wintertime we have these low pressure systems that go from the Alaskan panhandle all the way down to Oregon. Huge areas, 1,500 miles. Well, there's no way to outrun the storm force winds. So be prepared, plan your trips, and you'll avoid most of the problems. Now, that being said, if you're going to do a trip, you have to have certain tools in your toolbox to be able to handle these particular situations when the weather gets stormy. And when we went down the coast, Oregon and down California, we had 30-35 knots of wind at times, and in our boat, essentially when we get up to about 35 knots, we have no sail up, and our boat's doing about 8 knots under bare poles. It's a very light boat, and so that's kind of the limit where it gets kind of a little bit, we have to start doing something. But we never used our parachute anchor or Drogue all the way down to Mexico. And we practiced it when we were in the Sea of Cortez, deploying it and so forth, and we're going to get into some of those details now. Now, when we crossed from Cabo San Lucas to Hilo, Hawaii, this was in March of 2006, one of the key factors is we had decided that the parachute anchor was going to be our prime method of handling the heavy weather conditions. And one of the things you do with a parachute anchor is it's important that you set it up before you leave port so that it's ready to deploy from the stern, from the cockpit. Now, a parachute anchor off the bow, that technique essentially is you have a 12-foot parachute anchor, and ours was made by Paratech out of Colorado, and essentially it's a 12-foot parachute, two 50-foot bridle lines, then 300 feet of stretchy line out to the parachute. And we had that all carefully packaged in different bundles that we brought all the way back to the cockpit, so that when we wanted to deploy it, all we had to do was essentially throw it off while running downwind, throw it off the stern of the boat would go, and eventually the boat would swing into the wind. And that's the best way to do it. You don't want to be going out to the bow of the boat, tying on lines, trying to get all this equipment in the water, and during the day would be hard enough, let alone at night. So we had practiced setting it all up so we could deploy it from the stern. And when we were going to Hawaii, we had great weather. We had the winds were slowly starting to build, and we both remember the time we exactly got to the halfway point of our trip to Hawaii. It's 2,700 miles, and we got to the 1,350 mile point, and it's a kind of a very important time because you're keeping track of how many miles you've done, how many to go, and when you get halfway, you've done 1,350, you have 1,350 to go, and there's a great sense of, well, you almost feel like you're there, but you're only halfway. So we had this little celebration. We can remember it, Carly and I, very clearly. It was about 7 o'clock. It was nice, the beautiful sunset. We're doing about 6 knots. Everything looks great, and we worked it out. Oh, we should be there in about another 10 days. We're all so kind of excited. Well, the sun goes down, and what happens on the water, on the ocean anyways, is when it gets dark, all the motion gets amplified. You don't have the visual reference of the horizon. And same sea conditions, but it feels almost twice as rough. Well, it wasn't just getting dark. The wind did start picking up. Well, by about 11 o'clock at night, the winds were up to 30 knots. And it was getting it was dark, there was no moon, and we were a little bit kind of unsettled with the conditions. And so at first, we decided we were going to set our Drogue off the stern. And we had the Drogue set up. Now the Drogue goes off the stern of the boat, basically 30-foot bridles, 150 feet of line, and we used a 48-inch Delta Drogue. Now at this time we didn't set up the bridle, we just put it off the one stern, I guess was the starboard quarter, and we tried that because the winds were picking up. We thought maybe we'll just slow ourselves down. Well, the motion didn't seem to subside, so what we decided is that we were getting, I wouldn't say scared, but we were a little unnerved, so we decided that we were going to set up and deploy the parachute anchor. Now it was about maybe 35 to 40 knots. Wasn't really bad. It wasn't raining or anything, and the winds were from the east, but we thought, let's put this parachute anchor out and settle down. So it was about midnight when we finally decided to throw it overboard off the stern, and we threw it out, and of course we pivoted into the wind, and now the bow is facing east because that's where the wind is coming from. We want to go west to Hawaii, but now we're facing east, and there we were on our parachute anchor. Well, the parachute anchor, the point is it keeps your bows facing into the waves, so there's no way you can capsize because it's like you're anchored almost to the bottom, but you're anchored to the water. The parachute 12 feet essentially freezes its position into the water. It doesn't move. Now it's a very stretchy line that goes out to the parachute anchor, and when I would go and check the line when we were on it, I could easily pull it in because it totally distributes the force. There's no jerkiness at all, surprisingly, even less than what you would get on a windy day just anchored on a normal anchor in a bay. So we were set on this parachute anchor, but what we found is that you're facing into the waves, and the waves come roaring by, and they would hit the underside of the nacelle. And when they hit the underside of the nacelle on our boat, it was loud. And you almost thought, wow, it's going to tear off the bottom of the boat. So we were on this, we were listening to the weather, and this was as they call it, an El Nino year. And they said that, well, there was an area, and this is how big it was, 1,000 miles by 1,000 miles, and the winds were going to stay at 35 knots for approximately 2 weeks. Well, this isn't just like a fast-moving system that goes by, put out your parachute anchor, storm goes by, pull in parachute anchor, and go. Basically, nothing's going to change for 2 weeks. So we went through the whole next day, and we would check you have to check the bridle. That's the other thing. You have to check the points at the bow every couple hours because you got to go out there, make sure there's no chafe, and we had little big rubber hoses around the lines where they went through these big specially made chocks, and we'll show you some of the pictures as we go. And so I would go out there every 2 hours to check on it. But we were getting a little bit down, and what happens when you get down is you get kind of apathetic and like, I don't know if I should check it now, and well, I guess it'll get better. And you get this little apathy, and that's the worst thing that could happen. But we picked ourselves up, and I would go and check the lines, and sure enough, I would go out there, and the line had kind of come out of the chafe tubing and was starting to rub a little bit, but fixed it all up, and then we were set again, and time went on.
This is the big storm we're riding out on our parachute anchor.
Well, we went through that whole next day up to midnight, so now we're 24 hours on our parachute anchor, and listening to the weather, same thing, 1,000 miles square, 35 knots, not going to change for 2 weeks. And so we realized that though we were safe, what's the point in being safe if you can never leave? And the thought of being there for 2 weeks didn't make a lot of sense. So by the next morning, so now it's about 30 hours on the parachute anchor, it seemed that the winds had died down just a little bit. And it was clear at this point. Bright sunny sky. It's not stormy, it's just really windy. And they call it, the word they used was reinforced trade winds. So we said, look, we can't stay here forever. It was so kind of depressing. So what we did is we said, look, we're going to pull in the parachute anchor, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put the drogue out again, but we're going to put the drogue out on a bridle. So we had what is called a trip line that went from the cockpit all the way out to the head of the parachute anchor. And so this allows you to, in a sense, pull that trip line and collapse the parachute anchor and bring it all aboard. Otherwise, you have to actually motor into the waves, pulling the lines over the bow of the boat, and inevitably, as you get closer to the parachute anchor, it would be, kind of underneath the surface, and then you're trying to lift it out of the water. So the preferred method to retrieve it is to use this trip line. So we had our trip line. It was about a 1/4 inch line, went all the way to the head of the parachute anchor, and you have to pull 300 feet in, and then when you get the parachute anchor on your boat, then you got to pull in all the line, the 300 feet of the actual road of the parachute anchor. So I had this huge mound of line in the cockpit. I tried to do it as fast as I could. I'm not sure how long it took. Maybe it took me a half hour, I'm not sure, but I had this huge mound. And at that point, we set up the Drogue on a bridle. And this was the eureka moment of our trip, because when we put the Drogue on a bridle, now what happened is all the motion on the boat stopped. The boat, even though it was still probably 30-35 knots of wind, the boat was heading in the right direction because the winds were from the east. So now we're heading right back to Hawaii, where we want to go, and the boat speed was now locked at about 4.7 to 5 knots. And so it didn't accelerate down and start surfing down the waves and slow up. None of this surging, which is unnerving during the day and really scary at night. And your nerves just can't take it, this surging and speeding up hour after hour. But now we were just sort of locked in at this small variation. I would say it was about 0.3 of a knot. And that Delta Drogue on 150 feet just kept us at this steady pace and took away all the slewing motion which we had when we were sailing, even under bare poles, previously. And so now we had this big pile of line, which took probably a couple hours to unsort it all out. We packed it all up, and now we were just going to use that Drogue. And we were on the Drogue now for approximately 2 days, day and night, but at least we're heading in the direction of Hawaii, and we're doing 4.5 to 5 knots. And so now we're at least making progress, and we estimated it's going to take us still another 12 days to get there, but at least we were going somewhere. And so this was a real kind of confidence builder, because now we knew that the Drogue was the method of choice for our particular boat in these heavy weather conditions. Now, we see a lot of catamarans out there, some of their videos, people like Ben and Ashley on Nahoa, and they're on big lagoon 40-foot boats, which weigh about 20,000 pounds or more. Our boat weighs 8,000 pounds soaking wet with all the equipment on it, all our water, so it's a pretty light boat. So our threshold where the speed and surfing gets a little bit verging out of control is at a much lower wind speed. So at us, it's about 35 knots. We've got to think about slowing the boat down and making it steady to make it comfortable. Otherwise, on a long passage, you can't go day after day with 2 people, just 2 crew, dealing with the surging of the boat down the waves. And so we have found that that's our threshold point, 35 knots. Now on a bigger boat, like I said, a bigger lagoon or so forth, it may be 40, 45, 50 knots, but there is a point where you're going to want to slow that boat down because it's just going too fast down the waves. And when you get to nighttime, the autopilot can't quite keep up, and so it becomes quite unnerving. So this was our first experience of using the Drogue. We used it for 2 days, and then after about 2 days, the winds quote unquote moderated and were about 25 knots. And then we took the Drogue in, and then we just sailed at, again, that 4 to 6 knot speed that we were comfortable with, that the autopilot could steer. We didn't have to be on the sails monitoring it all the time. And so we found that for us, that Drogue was a much better solution than the parachute anchor. The parachute anchor, we seemed to be just kind of exposed to the waves as they came roaring by us. And we have a little bit of footage that I think we're going to show right now, showing the waves coming by and though it was not extreme conditions, it didn't feel as settled as with the Drogue. Now, another thing about Drogues is at that time, that was just about the point where people were starting to build their own Jordan Drogues. Now, a Jordan Drogue is a little bit different than the Delta Drogue. The Delta Drogue is a kind of a speed limiting thing. It sort of holds you at that, in our case, a 48-inch does 4.75 knots. We may even, if we ever go down the coast again, get a 36-inch, which we would deploy in sort of those moderate conditions and use it while having a sail out to kind of steady the boat. And we haven't experimented with that, but we would have a second Drogue as a backup anyways of the 48-inch. But a Jordan Drogue is more for, the really bad storm conditions where you're in 50, 60, survival type conditions. And the Jordan Drogue, and you can look it up on the internet, and we'll put some links down below in the comment section, are basically a series of cones, and it can be 100 to 200 cones depending on the weight of your boat. There's a length of the line, and essentially it's a long rope that has a lot of resistance through the water. And the idea is that in real extreme conditions, when you get those big breaking waves, the boat will accelerate but only go up to a certain point, and it has a little bit more give, but it's holding the boat essentially down to about that 1 knot range, as opposed to where we were doing 4 to 5 knots, and it was more where we're using a Drogue as a controlling device. The Jordan Drogue is more of a survival device, and we don't have any specific experience with a Jordan Drogue. But again, if we were going to go down and do our trip again and do the same route, we would have our 48-inch Drogue, which we use now. We would have a 36-inch Drogue, and we would also have a Jordan Drogue for, again, those really extreme conditions. So that's how we found it on our first trip over to Hawaii. Now, we went through the Hawaiian Islands for about 4 months. It was great. Went to all the islands, spent 5 weeks in beautiful Hanalei Bay, and that was our sort of jumping off point to come back to Vancouver. Now, when leaving the Hawaiian Islands, you can basically leave there from beginning of June to beginning of August, because you want to get back to the West Coast by the end of August. You don't want to start coming into September, because in September you're starting to get into gale season late September. And even when we left on July the 5th, day after Independence Day in the States, from Hanalei Bay. On our trip back, first part was idyllic. We had 5-10 knots of wind from the east. We were sailing in flat, calm seas. No swell, just unbelievable water. And sometimes there was hardly any wind, and we were just going at about 1 knot, 2 knots, slowly making away. And we have some beautiful pictures. I think we're going to show them now of the water, and it was an incredible sea state. But as you head up north, the basic route to go back to the West Coast from Hawaii is you head up north for about 1,000 miles, with the trade winds on your starboard side. And eventually, when you reach about 40 degrees north, you can start to make the turn to the east, and you're going to be in the westerlies, and then you're basically sailing downwind again all the way to Vancouver. And when we were going, day by day, the 74-degree water slowly cools down, and it's 73, 72, and now it's 68. And then eventually, somewhere around day 10, you realize, it's 58 degrees, and the water's 58 degrees, and it's foggy, and you go, oh yes, we are going back to Vancouver. The tropics is now history. So on our way back, we had a very good trip, and when we were in Mexico, we were much more apprehensive about the trip from Hawaii back to Vancouver than Cabo to Hawaii. We thought that was going to be the milk run, and the other one was going to be the tricky one. But the trip to Hawaii was the one that we had the really strong winds. And the other point I didn't mention, which is not really relative to the parachute anchor, is that when we were going to Hawaii and you're heading west, one thing we never read anywhere else is you're sailing downwind in these super strong trade winds. The thing that's happening, we left in March, beginning of March, is still in the North Pacific. You still have storms and gales, and what they're doing is they're sending a north swell coming down from the north into the area that you're transiting. And so what happens is you get this 10-foot swell from behind you from the strong trade winds, and then you got this 10-foot cross swell coming from these Pacific Northwest storms. Well, in that section in the middle where we were on the parachute anchor, there were some times where I would look back on the boat and you have the waves crisscrossing, and you would get these pyramidal waves, unusual shape. It's like they say you have to be there to see them, but they would just sort of mix and just go pointing straight up and kind of disappear. And so that created a little bit of motion even in our catamaran, but we were very thankful we were in a catamaran, because if you were in a monohull, that would not have been a happy time with that swell from 90-degree across directions. It would have been just a terrible passage and really, really rough. So we found that it was tolerable in our boat, and we were thankful for it. So anyways, back to the trip, going back to Vancouver. So halfway through the trip, it's cold, we're heading west, it's now foggy, and we made good time, and the trip was great. But about 500 miles off of Tofino, we were about 3 days away from Vancouver. There was a low pressure area coming through, and we found that they were predicting that they were going to have fairly strong winds, and the prediction was for gale force winds. So we'd already used our Drogue, we were ready for it, and I remember the day we were sort of progressed through the day. The wind started to build, from the southwest, 15, 20 knots, and around dinner time was about 25, and we were down to just the jib, and we were making 5, 6, 7 knots, and this was a rainy storm. It wasn't like the clear skies that we had in going to Hawaii, so it was a little bit a little more daunting, because when you get to nighttime in the open ocean, it's like being inside a closet. There's nothing that you can see. You can't even see the water. It's just pitch black, and so that's a little bit disorientating, and kind of almost creates a little vertigo, because you don't know which way is up. And so I was sleeping below, and Carly was on watch. It was about 11 o'clock, and Carly slides open the hatch and says, "I think we should put out the Drogue now." And so I come running out, and sure enough, we're doing 8 knots. And at this point, I think we had actually taken down the jib, but we were going too fast. So again, we put out the Drogue, and we had it all set up in the cockpit with the bridle, and we put it out, and bingo, within 1 minute, it's all out, and the boat's bang, 4.7 to 5 knots. And we went, and even though it was raining now and windy, it was totally safe, totally stable, and at this point we stayed in our center pod and slept up there for the night as we alternated watches. And we went through the whole next day up till about 5, 6 o'clock at night before it started to die down. And we don't have a wind meter on the boat, but there was a boat about 100 miles behind us, and they reported 47 knots of wind. So it was quite windy. And again, we would take the odd little spray, because the waves would kind of break a little bit behind the boat, and we'd get a little spray into the cockpit. But we were totally safe, and all the motion is taken out of the boat by using a Drogue. And so that was our second experience of using a Drogue, and we found it gave us a confidence that if we had those type of 45, 50 knot conditions, we could put out the Drogue and be totally safe.
Well, here we are, 400 miles from Victoria. Carly. And we're on our Drogue. Let's see if we get a picture of the wave action back here. can get a really big wave curling behind it.
Oh, here, don't say that.
Oh, it's for the camera. It's not all palm trees and surfer girls and...
Surfer girl, surfer
I mean, Carly's my surfer girl. I guess not going to get a big wave here.
It's almost like you're looking forward. It's okay, it's not going to happen again. Don't sit down and taking a bunch of pictures. You have to start out for 5 hours.
Totally safe. And so, you know, we really, you know, we see the Drogue as a better option for our particular boat. Now, we have met people who have used a parachute anchor. There was a couple in Sea of Cortez that we met, and they had used a parachute anchor in the Gulf of Alaska, and they were in like 60 knots. They survived, but that was probably 25 plus years ago, and we had met them about 10 years after that, and they were in, you know, obviously very serious conditions, and they used it. But the Drogue, you're going with the waves, and you're going with all that force behind you, and we found it's a much better motion in our type of boat. But if it was really, really strong, you know, kind of survival type conditions, having a sort of Jordan Drogue would be your sort of tool of last resort. And so there's a little bit of information about Drogues and parachute anchors, our experience, and just to summarize that the Drogue is we found to be the best for our type of boat. And really, whatever type of size of boat you have in terms of a catamaran, there is some point that you're going to want to slow that boat down, and you better be prepared for it, because you know, if you get up to 50 knots and you're fine in your lagoon and you're going now surfing at 15, 18 knots, wow, you got lots of force going on there. And if you don't have things worked out, how you're going to deploy it, where your attachment points are, and it's dark, you're going to be in trouble. And that's when things can happen, and you want to make sure that you have that system ready to deploy as soon as you want to do it. In a sense, it's almost like having a stern anchor. We have a stern anchor on Light Wave, a little 5 kilogram Bruce anchor, and it's in a milk carton in the back of the cockpit, and we can deploy that at the snap of a finger. And where a main anchor off the bow, you know, we got all these extra lines tying it up because it's a big rock anchor, you know, of 15 kilograms. It's a big brute, and you know, we want to have it properly secured. And you know, if we have to deploy that fast, it's 3-4 minutes. Where the stern anchor, when we're in a position, we were in a spot back in June 2 months ago where the engine stopped. We're going through a narrow channel, and we took our stern anchor and threw it out, boom, stopped the boat, and we didn't bump into anything. So a Drogue off the back of your boat, you have it ready to go, and at a moment's notice you're able to slow your boat down and basically relax. And the Delta Drogue is the one we've used, a 48-inch, and that kind of locks us, as I said, 4.7 to 5 knots, and it's almost like magic. And your boat's controlled, there's no slewing, and you're able to relax, and you just feel comfortable, especially when you get into nighttime, because it'd be one thing if you could sail across the ocean and it was daylight, you could handle all sorts of weather, but it's at night that's when you want to have the peace of mind that a Drogue will provide for you. Well, that's a little information on Drogues and parachute anchors, our experience. Like to have your comments below. Please, you know, put them in. We gladly answer any of your questions and create a little bit of dialogue. And we encourage you to subscribe to the B Catamaran Cruising channel. We're here to help you pass on some of the things that we've learned to make it easier for you and help you to get out there sailing and enjoy the great outdoors, and do it on a catamaran if you can, because that's the boat of choice for us. But hey, any boat on the water is better than being at the office on the 24th floor working on a spreadsheet. Okay, well, take care. Have a great day from Garrett, Carly, and of course Lightwave. Bye for now.
Watch the sun lift off the sea, cast the shadow off a tree.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also hit the like button and also the little bell to be notified of our new videos. So goodbye from Carly, Garrett, and of course Lightwave.